Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Parsons Technical Webinar Series. I'll be your host today, Jessica Bennett. Today, we are excited to have with us Kyle Metz, presenting on California Dreaming, a look at his current and future orphan well liabilities. Go through a few housekeeping items first. You can go to the next slide, please. So we will be keeping all phone lines muted during the Q&A session, during the presentation until the Q&A session at the end. If you have questions during the webinar, you can enter them into the chat at any time, and we'll get to them at the end, or you can hold your question and raise your hand to ask it live at the end as well. This webinar has been approved for 1 professional development hour or PDH credit. If you would like to receive a PDH certificate, there will be a link to an attendance form posted in the chat several times throughout the webinar. There will be 3 multiple choice questions you'll need to answer on that form, so please take a look at that early in the webinar. If you miss any questions or content or have any issues, please let us know. And also, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Parsons YouTube channel in the next few days. Next slide, please. So a brief agenda for today's webinar. I'll introduce our guest speaker, Kyle Metz, followed by a core value moment, and then we'll get into the technical presentation, go through the current status of the oil and gas industry, look at California specifically as a test case for a mature industry, and then wrap up with a path forward. And then we'll close out the webinar today with a Q&A session. Next slide, please. Kyle's a geologist at Parsons with over 15 years experience in the oil and gas industry. He has worked in multiple basins across the US, from California to Appalachia, including exploration, development, and operations in both conventional and unconventional plays. He's currently leading business development efforts for orphan well plugging at Parsons. And with that, I will hand it off to Kyle for the core value moment.
Thanks, Jessica. Before we get started, there's just a little CYA thing here. The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter and me, and don't necessarily reflect those or any official policy or position of Parsons or our clients. And all the content provided by the presenter is of my opinion and is not intended to malign any organization, company, or individual. And I put that in there because, you know, the oil and gas and orphan well liability asset retirement obligations can be somewhat contentious at times, and as we can see moving forward. As for a core value, Parsons has been rated one of the highest ethical or most ethical companies in the US for a number of years running, and I believe that's because of our core values and our adherence to them. So these include safety, quality, integrity, diversity, innovation, and sustainability. I'd like to focus on integrity today. I think you'll see why in this presentation integrity is important, but you know, I've always heard that integrity is doing the right thing even when no one's looking, or if it's not required, you know, do the hard right versus the easy wrong, if you will. And as you can see later in this presentation, I mean, you know, there are significant liability or asset retirement liabilities or obligations in the oil and gas industry. And I think, you know, as a industry as a whole and a society, we've kind of kicked the can down the road quite a while. And I think it's time for all of us to kind of come together under this idea of integrity and do the right thing. So the status of the oil and gas industry as a whole, it's really a tale of 2 industries, as I've kind of put in here. So there's been some amazing innovation in the industry over the past 15, 20 years that has really changed basically society, from you know, geopolitical climates to just a stabilization in prices of everything, not just oil and gas, but oil and gas is used and that energy is used in the production of every material that we use in our modern society. And so this innovation is largely from unconventional shale development plays, and you can see the effects of this in some of these graphs here. So these graphs are mostly from the Energy Information, the US EIA, or Energy Information Administration, part of the DOE, I believe. So here's a graph, the first one of, let me get the laser pointer on. Crude oil liquid fuels production, just showing the stability. So when we think of oil production, we often think of OPEC, right? And the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. They're largely, centered in the Middle East, and then we have, I believe, Venezuela and Russia, or OPEC plus, and some North African countries. And they're all great individually, but associated with many of these countries are geopolitical risks, or above ground risks, as we'd say. So if you think about that, you think about the war in Ukraine right now. When Russia reinvaded Ukraine, prices spiked in 2022 up to, I think, $120 a barrel from 75, 80, and then they came back down, and they came down because of the price stability that the U.S. provides. And you can see the same thing. There's unrest in the Middle East right now between Israel and Iran, and the associated members in that region. And we're not really seeing the effects of that in global commodity prices. That's largely because our production here of U.S. crude oil is just so stable, and you can see that it's been increasing over the past few years, but has stabilized and projected to be stable within the near future. And you can see that as just changes are stepping down. It's largely a decrease in crude oil production, but we're maintaining natural gas liquids and biofuels. And if you look at this graph here, this is a graph of net imports of crude oil and liquid fuels. Blue is crude oil imports from 2018 to 2025. You can see the drop in crude oil imports. We still import some, but we export. So we import about 1 to 2 million barrels a day, but we export 4 to 5 million barrels a day. So we're a net exporter, and we're actually the #1 oil producer in the world, which not a whole lot of folks are aware of. At least always growing up, I was always told we were a huge importer, and we needed to worry about that. Anyway, natural gas trade. So gross imports above the line in red, and gross exports below the line in blue. In gray here, we are a net exporter of about 15 billion cubic feet a day, both by pipeline and liquefied natural gas over ships to, say, Japan, Asia, and also, importantly, Europe right now. And where this change in the industry becomes very apparent is in the net trade hydrocarbon gas liquids graph here from 2004 to 2024. You can see a change happening. We're a net importer up until about 2010. Something changes, and then we just start exporting significant volumes. So what changed around then? Well, it's really the advent of these unconventional plays. And an unconventional play, you guys have all heard of them, even if you're not familiar with the oil and gas industry. It's, the shale gas, or the shale boom, the fracking revolution, if you will. So you drill a horizontal well anywhere between 5,000 to 10,000 or more feet horizontally through a shale or a tight sandstone, and you can inject a lot of water for a slick water frac to fracture the rock, increase the contact area, the surface area on pore space, and then extract that oil or natural gas liquids, i.e. condensate, from those rocks. That's important because the environment that these formations are deposited in are generally pretty homogeneous. Their energy depositional energy is pretty quiescent, if you will. So you can have, instead of a field that might cover a couple hundred to a few thousand acres, it'll cover, a few 100,000 to 1 million acres or more. If you look at like the Permian here, not all of it produces the same, but those unconventional formations are present throughout. So it really takes the risk out of the development of these shale plays, if you will. And because of that, you can see production trends from 2009 to 2025 projected here. We started out about 3 million barrels a day. Crude oil production has gone up to roughly 11, 12 million barrels a day is the forecast for 2025. And you can see about 2/3 of that was this other in this beige color. That'd be your conventional plays. So you drill a vertical well into a nice sandstone reservoir, you produce oil out of it, the highly permeable and porous sandstone. The unconventional plays only accounted for, about 1 million barrels a day, so 30%. But now they account for over 83% of production. And these conventional plays have remained relatively steady. There's been some slight drops, but overall steady. And this is production for U.S. onshore and or state waters, not like deep water offshore federal waters, I believe. Same story is true in the natural gas market. You can see largely dominated by conventional, but over time, in the last decade and a half, the unconventional plays, especially in the Appalachian Basin and the Permian, have really grown and account for the bulk of natural gas production. So if 83% of production is from these unconventional plays, that means and 12% of active onshore wells, or 110,000 wells, are unconventional wells. That means that 17% of all the wells drilled from the invention of the oil industry in Titusville, PA, back in the late 1800s to 10 years ago, those are pretty much all conventional wells, and there's a lot more than 110,000 of those, and those only account for about 17% of total production. So we have, of those conventional wells, there's 760,000 marginal wells, which means they produce less than 15,000 or 15 barrels of oil a day, or 90,000 cubic feet of gas. And they count only for 8% of total onshore oil and gas production. So 760,000 wells only produce 8% of the total production in the U.S. Pretty much all the rest of the production belongs to 12% of the wells. Oops. So if we look at a map here of this is a USGS map displaying all the oil and gas wells within the lower 48. So gas is in red, oil wells are green, and condensate, which is light volatile, like natural gas liquids, including like butane, propane under certain pressures, obviously, natural gasoline, etc. Those that's in yellow. And you can see, based on this chart, kind of the distribution of these wells. There's 920,000 active oil and gas wells. It means wells that are reporting production according to the Energy Information Agency. There are 760,000 marginal wells, as I mentioned. So those wells produce very little oil and gas. And so that means there's 160,000, quote unquote, good producers. So they're not marginal wells. 110,000 of those are unconventional wells. That means 50,000 are conventional. Those are probably, in this region here, for being honest. And the US EPA estimates there's about 2 million idle wells. And so in gray, which you don't see here, are dry and abandoned wells. But then, if 2 million wells are idle and there's 920,000 active wells, this is all wells in the US. So, 2/3 of these dots here are likely gray. And so there's really just those handful of wells that are really, really providing all this production. And so if we take the 2 million idle and abandoned wells with the 900,000 active wells, that's about 3 million total wells. And only 5% of those 3 million wells are actually, quote unquote, good wells producing 83%, if you will, of the total oil and gas. So that means that when it comes time to plug all these, there's 3 million wells that need to be plugged. And, there's 5% of the wells that aren't plugged need to carry the cost to plug every well in the US. And so before we talk too much about plugging wells, we want to look at documented orphan wells. Well, so those were active idle wells within and abandoned wells, but have a solvent owner within the U.S. This map shows it's from the Environmental Defense Fund, showing the documented is important, orphan wells within the U.S. According to USGS, their numbers, there's 120,000 documented orphan wells in the U.S. This is the distribution that the EDF shows. So, large concentrations in Appalachia, where, the oil industry really got started here in PA, northwestern PA, through Kentucky into Illinois, which might be surprising to some folks. And then into the mid-continent, you've got, Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma here. Obviously, there's going to be orphan wells through Louisiana, Texas, and southeastern New Mexico. Then a smattering through, the West, including California here. And so these are the documented orphan wells. Undocumented orphan wells, according to numerous agencies that have done counts, they range anywhere between 300,000 to 800,000 or more undocumented orphan wells. So that's a well that has no record at all. The state doesn't even, no one knows about it. The state doesn't know about it. It could be under your house or in your backyard and you don't know about it, but it could be leaking potentially. And those are largely a result of drilling, say 1880. It's not like those folks really kept good records, and submitted them with state agencies that didn't exist to regulate this stuff with. So, those wells are often out there and they can pose a pretty significant environmental hazard. Before we talk too much about orphan wells, I should probably define exactly what those are. So an abandoned or an orphan well, abandoned is kind of a loose term. So abandoned could mean, some states define it differently, but a well that no longer reports production and does not have a future use. So an idle well could be a well like a car that just breaks down. It needs, some new tires or a new water pump, or in this case, you pull the tubing, you replace some tubing, or there's a hole in the casing, you patch that up, or you replace the pump, and you can turn the well back on. And that's good. That's an idle well with future use. An abandoned well has no future use, supposedly. And so, it just stops reporting production. And but it does have an owner. Now, an orphan well is a well that has no owner of record. And so that wells become orphan because the owner could go bankrupt and then just disappears, and it gets kind of lost in the paperwork shuffle of bankruptcy. Or, it could predate, as I mentioned, predate regulatory efforts, and there's no record. Now, 20% of all wells are leaking methane, oil, or brine. That's from, I can't remember the publication, I think out of McGill University. They've done some studies. And pretty much 20% of all wells leak oil, methane, or brine. And a lot of wells that have been orphaned or abandoned were never plugged, improperly plugged, or the plug has degraded or failed over time. And so what happens is, if it was never plugged, the producing zone can get methane into the wellbore and it can leak up. And then if the well head integrity fails, it could leak out through the wellhead. It could leak out through, if there's a hole in the casing and the cement integrity has failed, it could leak out through the casing at surface, or, it could leak up and just outside and get into the soil or groundwater and, pollute the groundwater, degrade the soil. And so it becomes a pretty serious issue. And so the effects of leaking methane, methane is a 30 to 80x global warming, or has 30 to 80 times the global warming potential of CO2. So it's a really potent greenhouse gas. And petroleum and salt impacts, generally regulated to the soil. I mean, there's, unwanted chemicals in petroleum, benzene, toluene, those sorts of things, and then chlorides and other salts within the brines, not to mention naturally occurring radioactive material and things like that can get in the soil and distress the plant life and cause all sorts of issues. And these are important because 14 million people in the U.S. live within a mile of an orphan well and likely don't know about that. So how did we get into this mess? How did we get into this situation where there's, 14 million people living within 1 mile of an orphan well? It's a great question. So in order to get an understanding of this, I don't think it was malicious how we got into the situation. It just, happens, over time. And a good way to look at, how this happens is, in my opinion, California. So California is a pretty mature oil industry, and it's sort of an energy island of itself. Like it's somewhat self-contained, and it has not had the revitalization through that unconventional revolution that we mentioned before. Due to some geologic reasons and then some regulatory reasons, it's very difficult in California to make a shale play work, if not impossible. So it's a great study to look at the old conventional, oil and gas industry without all the noise and overprinting of those unconventional wells. So just to give you a little bit of background on California, production began late in the 19th century, somewhere in the coastal region. Everyone seems to say that their field was the first field discovered, either Ojai, California, above Ventura, or in Ventura or the LA basins. There Will Be Blood was actually, supposedly took place in California. But there's production all the way from the northern end of the San Joaquin Basin, or Mendocino, California up here. There's a couple of small gas fields here, but from basically Redding, California, all the way down to San Diego, or the south end of Orange County, really. These wells out in here are generally geothermal wells. These well spots are from CalGEM, which is the California Geologic Energy Management, and it used to be Dogger, which is oil, gas, and geothermal energy. So anyway, while these wells and production are statewide, 70% of the production is in Kern County, which is pulled out here, and the production is generally dominated by large conventional fields and reservoirs. So you get these large anticlines with thousands of wells in them, and there's some very interesting geology here driving this. But to give you an example of what one of these oil fields looks like and why the plugging and abandonment and asset retirement obligations are important in California, this is a cherry picked example. I'll admit that, but this is pretty typical for a Kern County area. This is a Kern River field, kind of northeast end of Bakersfield. So if we zoom in, you can see the extent of the Kern River field just based on the surface disturbance here and the aerial view. You can see all the pads and roads and grading. If we zoom in, just to give you an idea of the well spacing versus, a neighborhood here, this is Oildale, or I think locals would call it Royaldale, the fancy part of Oildale. If you zoom in here, you can see each one of these like dark specks is a pump jack or a wellhead, and you've got multiple, producing tank batteries. You got flow lines, you have steam lines going all over here. You have roads. The surface disturbance is huge, and it wouldn't be cheap to fix and return to, pre-industry state, much less plugging all these wells. And you can see the spacing on them is, at least one well per, residential lot, if not more than that. And you can see this Getty image here, just a view of Kern River Field, and just the tight spacing of these wells. So the field was discovered in 1899, and there's no way there are records of wells to 1899 that are accurate, at least. Average producing depth of the field is 400 to 1,300 feet, so it's not terribly deep. It covers about 11,000 acres, 10,700, and it's produced 2.5 billion barrels. Or, sorry, I think it's 2.5 billion barrels oil recoverable, or OOIP, or original oil in place, that is recoverable. So we zoom out to the overall production in California. So oil production in California, and production generally in California, is dominated by oil. It's not a very gassy basin. The source rocks aren't very mature. So oil production is synonymous with oil and gas production, generally speaking, on a statewide basis. So California oil production, you can see it peaked at over 1 million barrels a day in 1986, and then the crash of 86, 87 happened, and it just never quite recovered. It's been declining ever since. You see a couple of peaks, one in the late 90s, and then again in the mid 20 teens. Is that what we call that these days? Where some investment happened, or a new innovation. I believe this was a steam injection into porcelainite rocks, which really shallowed out the decline curve. But in 2014, 2015, you guys might remember, but oil prices were over $100 a barrel, and every investment bank, et cetera, they were looking to get a return on investment. And so there was a lot of private equity and a lot of funding, within companies themselves for exploration and growth. And so you can see this is a graph of rig count, so active land rigs in California over time, and this same region from 2012, 2010 to 2015 really probably averaged about 45 active rigs in a day. And so that's a lot of capital investment in this neck of the woods in the state of California, and it resulted only in a slight bump in production. And then ever since the 2015 downturn, there's been a steepening of decline, actually. And so the point of all that is that despite capital investment, you're not really getting a lot of return. You're not seeing this revolution in production in California like you are elsewhere, where you have these unconventional plays. You can see, that private equity or private capital has really kind of fled California, and that capital expense investment has never really recovered to where it was prior to 2015. And even then, here in 2022, we're sitting at, I think, 2 to 3 rigs statewide, which is scary to think about. And so this next graph here is a little complicated. This is from the same study. But so what these show is, so the state, you have to report your production, and then you can go back and pull all that data. It's publicly available. And what this is showing is the last year of production for all wells in that year. So let's say the wells that all went offline and never reported production again in 2010. This is the median production they had. This star is the average production they had. And then this is just a spread of that data. So what you can see here is the historical median of all production over the past, decade plus of wells that died and never came back because they were uneconomic. It was about, we'll just call it 3 barrels a day. And this yellow bar is the average, or, the average of all the wells that are currently producing. So all active wells in California right now. And that median is just above that, 3 barrel a day mark. It's at, 4 maybe barrels a day. And interesting, you can see a slight increase in the past couple of years of that median and average production of wells going offline. And we can speculate what that is. Maybe it's due to increased OpEx, which operating expense is, if a well breaks down, it's your mechanic bill to go fix it, right? So, maybe all the cheap, oil changes and tire changes have already happened, and now you're into a head gasket at this point now, and it's just not economic to get that fixed to bring back that 3 barrels a day, or in this case 4 or 5 barrels a day. We're also maybe we're just not seeing exactly what's there. But things don't typically get cheaper over time, as we're all painfully aware of. Inflation is a thing, including wages and materials. And so the bar to this value is going to continue to increase, I imagine. Point is all the wells that are currently producing now, on average, are basically at the limit where if they break down, they will not be brought back online on a gross average across the state. Now, individual wells may vary, But that's generally what it looks like from a 30,000 foot elevation. So statewide asset retirement obligations in California. So there's a lot of numbers here. I want to look at here is so study there's well counts and well statuses from the CalGEM database, so the publicly available state database. Brought these well counts in, unplugged well bores. That's those here. So 11,000 in blue in the coastal areas, 7,000 LA Basin, 2,000 wells in the Sacramento Basin, and 87,000 wells in inland. That includes Kern County, predominantly, like that Kern River field I showed you. That's why there's so many more wells there. Now, the average cost per well bore, this was calculated as decommissioned costs were estimated using CalGEM's methodology, which they released in 2022 to give operators, what's the term I'm looking for? I guess some sort of defensible cost calculator for these asset retirement obligations. And we've come through here, this study came through here, and all the data are from public sources and just industry experience, or directly from the companies in forms of like 10K or investor relation reports and presentations. So the average cost per well bore, depending on where you are in California, 162,000 per well to 55,000 per well, and that's dependent on depth and then location, right? If you're out in the middle of an oil field, you don't really have to worry so much about site access. You can just drive right up to it, plug the well. As long as you've got your permits, you're good to go. And if the well is 1,000 feet deep, it's going to be a lot cheaper than a well that's 10,000 feet deep, or in someone's backyard, or in the middle of a golf course, or under a lake, which we can talk about later. So all these things like play into the cost of the plugging of the well bores. As far as facilities go, so facility is like, you've got the well, then you've got the pumps, you've got tanks, you have pits, you have flow lines, pipelines, the steam lines, all this stuff. Those are all part of the facilities costs, and those can be just as expensive as largely linear infrastructure. I think is a term that y'all might be more familiar with. Nothing too fancy here, but the facilities costs for total decommissioning statewide, call it $8 billion. These numbers are in millions, so 600 million or 5.7 billion, 5.76 billion, and then the plugging cost is $7.5 billion to plug every unplugged well in California today. That's active, idle wells in California. So that's a total of $13.1 billion to plug and reclaim all the land, excluding, remediation from spills and historic, events. That's just to plug and remove the facilities and restore it to quote unquote natural state. So $13.1 billion to do that. If we look at the funds existing funds to make that happen, you can see again, this is in millions here. So there's 359 million state and city funds for Wilmington Field. So that's State Lands Commission run field offshore Long Beach. So that's pretty well, stocked, but that's only specifically for those wells. There's 106 million of surety bonds from the operators. So often, I can't recall what the exact number is in California. It might be $20,000 for a blanket bond. Something in that order sounds about reasonable, unless it was recently updated in the past 5 or so years. But generally, from up in Appalachia where I've been working lately, it's $5,000 to $10,000 a well with a blanket bond at $20,000 to $30,000, and that means that's all you got to put down, and you forfeit that money if you don't plug that well or all your wells. So there's 106 million there, and then the federal funding here, $165 million through the recent federal funding of the Orphan well grant programs. And the state has a budget of $100 million in their orphan well plugging budget. So that's a total of $730 million, which isn't quite 13.1 billion. And if you look at those, 86% of the funding is from government entities, which means what, 14% of the available funds is funded through the industry that needs to plug these in the first place. And the industry surety bond covers less than 1% of the total asset retirement obligation. And it's, that was designed to cover that cost, or at least provide incentive for the companies to want to plug their wells. But if I were looking at a bill of 106 million or 13.1 billion, I know which one I'd pay. Anyway, so the question is, where does the other 12.4 billion come from? It's difficult. If you talk to these operators, they'll say, "Oh, well, our future cash flows." So, you're telling me that it's going to cost $13.1 billion to plug these wells, but those wells are producing oil and gas right now and making money. So if we take the money we get from these wells that are producing and save some to plug the wells, problem solved. And that's a very valid argument. Let's look at those numbers. So this study looked at these numbers. And so future revenues, this was estimated from looking at decline curves and from reported production on these wells. And it took, there's various types of production, whether it's a secondary heavy oil steam or water flood or conventional primary production. And depending on the geology, they did a pretty good job of breaking this up, determining decline curves across companies, and then OPEX costs for the various companies that, as reported in 10Ks and public investor relations reports and whatnot. And so if you look at one caveat. So these numbers are only looking at the existing wells today, so proved developed producing wells. So wells that are drilled and producing, that's a developed reserve number. We're not looking at PUDs or proved undeveloped. So if I've got a well in one spot, I could drill a well 80 feet away and comfortably assume that second well would produce just like the one right next to it. That'd be a proved undeveloped location. But we're not considering those, or this analysis did not consider those in that. So that is one caveat where you could have more future revenue, theoretically. So total future revenues based on historical production trends, i.e. decline curve analysis, looking at $30.5 billion, which is great. That's more than $12.4 billion. So sure, we can cover that. However, companies don't just run themselves. You got to pay for your G&A, taxes, maintenance capital, all your OPEX or operating expenses to keep those wells running, keep those pumps running, to pay for the electricity to run the pumps that produce the oil and gas, generate the electricity to run themselves. And so when you strip out the future costs based on the operating expenses and maintenance capital, you're looking at, that's looking at about $24 billion of costs. And so when you do the math, 30 minus 24, you're looking at $6 billion left over and future cash flow from operations, which, if you recall, that's about half of the $12.4 billion gap that we have. So if we do that math, I mean, it's pretty simple, but future cash flow is $6.3 billion. Quantified liabilities is 13.2. But we have that 700 million from public sources, more or less, and surety bonds. That leaves about 6.9, $6.2 billion shortfall. And so clearly, I mean, there's a shortfall, $6.9 billion. That's no small thing. And that means a number of these wells will not get plugged Even if this, if these estimates are off significantly, there's still a number of wells, a few $1 billion of wells that won't get plugged. So what are some solutions? Because we're all in this together. It's all our environment, not just one person. So there's a few paths forward. You can either treat the cause or you can treat the symptoms, as I always like to think about it. So prefer to treat the cause. One potential solution is the SEC regulatory environment, right? So the Securities and Exchange Commissions requires companies to disclose detailed information about their financial status, including reserves, productions, risks, future cash flows, as we've seen, and settlement of asset retirement obligations. Now, historically, companies could argue that the abandonment date or that AOR or asset retirement obligation to abandon the well, it's kind of uncertain. We don't know when whether it's going to be 10 years from now or 50 years from now. That well could keep producing indefinitely. And the cost is trivial. If you have a $10 million well and $120,000 abandonment, that's a rounding error. So the cost is trivial. Don't have to worry about it now or 50 years from now. Just, it's a rounding error, not a big deal. Well, that's maybe true unless you've got 20,000 of these things you got to worry about. Then it becomes an issue. But the SEC is saying that now you are going to have to quantify those asset retirement obligations, or at least there's talk of this. So that's great. That works for publicly traded companies in the US, but not so much for private companies or companies on foreign exchanges. And so this is a company that's pretty well known in the US. It's actually the number one operator by well number within the US. But they are traded, I believe, on the London Stock Exchange or maybe the Canadian Stock Exchange. So they don't fall under the purview of the SEC. If you look at this, 96% of their wells are financially distressed or uneconomic. So 4% of their wells make money. The rest are basically loss leaders, if you will. They've got 1% of their wells are high producing, 1% are stripper wells, and which is, definitions vary. It's maybe a little better than a marginal well, which is 15 barrel a day cutoff or 90 MCF, and then 2% are marginal. So 96% of their wells are a problem or a potential problem. And so their plan for their P&A plan, if you will, or asset retirement plan, what they've put forward is this is their cash flow basically in blue, their profits. So commodity revenue in blue here tails off their annual P&A cost. They're going to put, let's call it $20 million. It's so low I can't tell. A year into plugging and abandoning wells. Somewhere in 2055-ish, they stop making money, but their plan is 40 years later, 2095, they'll still be spending $20 million a year to plug wells. And so if they decide to stop that when they stop, being profitable about here, that's going to leave all those wells, they would have only put that much money into plugging their wells. So that is a concern. And that's how we get into the situation in the beginning. So another treating of the symptom, if you will. This one's a little contentious. So prior operators are not generally financially responsible for plugging costs under the state laws. So what that means is if company A sells to company B, then company B goes bankrupt, company A is not financially responsible for company B's bad decisions. However, in California, they have a law where that the state can claw back costs to the prior owner up to 1996. And so, whether that's fair or not, it does exist in California. Some other states are looking at similar laws if they haven't passed them already. So other things, treating the symptom now. The federal government has provided nearly $5 billion in orphan well plugging remediation restoration funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law under Biden. Back in 2022, I think it passed, maybe 21. So there's numerous grant programs that all add up to about $4.75 billion. The state formula grant is the biggest one. The initial grant gave basically all these states that are, reporting anything here. They all had $25 million to go out and plug their orphan wells. And you can see some states, plug 2,000 wells or more. Some states did, one well. This is as of reporting time. So I assume they got more than one well done. I'm sure Alaska got a couple of wells done. But you can see the states that participated. And then after that, they're given some funding through this formula grant to plug wells. And that's where we come in. So Parsons has been pursuing these well plugging projects and managing well plugging projects for nearly 2 decades now. And we offer a full turnkey service for the orphan well life cycle. So from planning and management, high grading which wells should be plugged, to locating and prioritizing those wells, either with drones or methane detection, emissions, satellite imaging, etc. And then we actually go out and we manage the plug-in abandonment and remediation of the sites. And then we've also gotten into the carbon credit space. So one way to pay for these programs that's been kicked around in the industry is carbon credit capture. So if a well is leaking, 50 tons of methane a day, then you could capture, if you plug it, say it'll leak for another 20 years, that many tons a day you can capture and then sell those credits on the open market if you pay for the plugging. So we do this for a number of both private and public entities. We're going to focus really on the locating and prioritization because I think that's where a lot of the new growth and innovation is coming from. I only have a couple more slides, so bear with me, please. Not a long sales pitch here. But there are numerous challenges locating wells. Sometimes the surface casing has been cut off. Often that was due in World War II. They needed to recycle as much steel and iron as they could for the war effort. So a lot of these old fields, they cut off casing below surface, took the casing out and recycled it. Often wells are in highly vegetated areas. If they're buried, cut off, you have to dig down, and exploratory digging is not the easiest or cheapest thing to go poking around finding wells. It's like a needle in a haystack. So there are some traditional well locating methods. You look at the state databases, the survey locations. You can look at USGS quadrangles, to see where these things were sited, but they're all imprecise. And oftentimes, if they're cut off below surface, it's going to be very hard to find that. And so ground magnetometry surveys were kind of invented to try and image these things, but this is a result of a ground mag survey that was walked over where a well was cut off at over 200 feet below ground surface. And as you can see, you're not picking that up. You don't see a very obvious well bore in this survey here. So the advent of airborne magnetometry surveys, what you can do is you can fly a drone over a larger area. You can cover much quicker than someone can hike around and poke around in the weeds to find these things. And the magnetometer is hung below the drone here, so you don't get interference from the drone or its motors. And then you set up a geophysical survey base station, and you fly your drone. And then this is the kind of result after our proprietary data processing is applied. And you can see these bullseyes for these wells. These are buried up to, we can find these or locate these up to 300 feet below ground surface. And our accuracy when we did this pilot study was about 12.5 feet, or within basically at the 3-meter accuracy of our GPS that was on board the drone. But now we're down to 1 to 1.5 meter resolution on these, which is if you compare that to the state databases, the state database can be 50 feet off. So if you got an excavator, you're digging, looking for a well, it helps to be within a few feet rather than within 50 feet. Some other challenges that we see in where drones can help us out when we're locating these things are land use changes. So, the oil and gas industry is a 4-dimensional puzzle. And you can see that here. This is a 1938 picture of an oil and gas field. I mean, you can see the the lease roads and the pads here. You can see this river. What you don't see here necessarily is a river. You see a lake, and then these well spots are underneath that lake. So, you'd never be able to find that without flying a drone over it. And then you got to build a little derrick over the water to get to that and plug those so they don't leak into the lake. Similarly, here's another example on a golf course. Well, really, it was an oil field. Then it was a sand mine or quarry operation. Then it became a golf course with a nice lake in the middle of it. And we've done these really complex plugging jobs in unique environments, if you will. Where here we had to complete during the winter season, where the golf course was closed, the ground was hard, so we didn't completely tear it up, and we had to build a temporary pad and partially fill the lake as well to get in there and plug this well. And we had to protect and repair all the affected area, and so the golf course could open back up in the spring, and no one was the wiser. So that said, some key takeaways: there's a potential huge shortfall in operator and public funds to cover the full asset retirement obligations. Asset retirement obligations must be planned either through voluntary savings or through regulatory action to prevent, marginal and idle wells from becoming orphan. So state and federal programs are taking proactive steps to reduce this risk, which I think is good. Some methods are probably better than others. And then there's innovative methods for orphan well management that must be integrated. And we can't plug them all, at least not now as things sit. So we need to make sure we're plugging the right ones. And that includes, various surveys, planning and management tools, locating the right orphan wells, and then novel plugging approaches, and potentially finding funding through quantifying carbon credits and things like that. So without further ado, questions?
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. It was a great presentation on the big issue of orphan wells and some ways that things are being innovated to try and address them better. First, you got to find them. If anybody has any questions, you can either enter them into the chat now, and we'll read them out, or you can raise your hand and you can ask it live. Looks like we've already got a couple in the chat. First one's from Kristen Sorowski. Your case study was about California, where production has declined. Is anyone looking at this where oil and gas production is growing?
Yes, actually. Sorry, I think my PowerPoint just crashed. I'll bring that back up. Yes. So there's a couple of nonprofit organizations looking, say, in Appalachian Basin in particular. Some of those figures were from the Ohio River Valley Institute. So what's interesting about places outside where these unconventional programs have really taken off is that there's potential funding, through a state levy or a federal, a minor tax like a severance tax, which would be helpful for paying for such a program. Sorry, I'm trying to get my PowerPoint back up. That is my answer to that. Did that answer that question?
Yeah, sorry, just giving you a second
Right,
to
Yep. All
get
right, sorry.
PowerPoint. Of course, it crashes right. At least it didn't crash during the actual presentation.
Yeah, that would have been.
Next question's from Richard Inklema. Why is the oil well spacing so tight in the Kern River field in California? Did they follow a grid layout system? Are producing intervals or targeted total depth within producing formation versus horizontal proximity regulated or taken in mind with such tight spacing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rich. A little bit of both. So California is dominated by these large conventional traps, if you will. So a large anticline trap with multiple producing horizons in it often. And so each horizon may be spaced differently. And so, one well 20 feet from another well might not be producing from the same zone, depending on when they were drilled. So that's one reason. The other reason, and probably the more important reason, is California has a lot of heavy oil. So you think of the Brea tar pits. It's not quite tar in the subsurface in these formations, but it's really heavy. And so to mobilize it, you have to inject a lot of steam to raise the temperature to make it less viscous so it'll flow into your oil wells or your producing wells. Um, However, the drainage radius on those wells is much tighter than in a conventional system where you've got a higher API oil and a less viscous fluid.
Okay, let's see, there's another question. For Melanie Perez, how has the new administration affected the federal funding for orphan well plugging?
So funding was paused temporarily when the freeze was first announced. It has been, to my understanding, unfrozen. The formula grant, so there's like $2 billion in the formula grant, for example, which is a 4-year program for the states, and they get, the first year's already been awarded and was, it's the phrase I'm looking for. All of the funding for all of it has been through appropriations in Congress, so it all should be released. The first year, for sure, the states have their hands on. I think the following 3 years, there might be some, provisions like DEI provisions and language that needs to be removed. A lot of it was funded or intended towards the environmental justice. I think the Justice 40 movement. Basically, 40% of the funds needed to be executed in like disadvantaged communities, but I think that is now out. But the funding remains in general.
All right, thanks, Kyle. If anyone else has any other questions, you can feel free to reach out to Kyle directly. His contact information is here on the slide. If we can go to the next slide. So our next webinar will be on April 9th at the same time, 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. Eastern. We'll be on Fenton's Chemistry Groundwater Treatment System for Destruction of 1,4-dioxane, and that will be presented by Ted Schoenberg. A link to the form for PDH credit has been posted in the chat a few times. If you have any issues downloading that form and you'd like PDH credit, please contact us and we'll help you out with that. And we will be issuing PDH certificates later this month once you send that in. And finally, if you miss any of the questions when reviewing the content, a recording of this webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel in the next few days. And thank you to everybody who joined us today, and we hope to see you again in April.